Thank you, Freddie. This workshop is listed as a critical analysis of the city budget, and I'll start with a brief talk that I'm calling Robbing Peter to Pay Paul, or should I say robbing Angelenos to pay for City Hall's peccadillos. My role here is to focus your attention on some of the issues so you will listen more closely to Jack's more detailed topics that follow, and then join in a 20-minute Q&A discussion with us on these issues following. Okay, at $11.4 billion, this year's Los Angeles budget puts many nations to shame. Despite record revenues plus a $1.3 billion gift from the feds, the city of Los Angeles continues to face serious financial challenges. Yes, it suffered from the fiscal impact of the pandemic over the past 18 months, but our current situation is the result of the failure of the city council and mayor to address the city's finances over the previous 7 years of plenty, during which the city received record revenues. They had lots of opportunities to balance the budget and didn't. Instead, they kowtowed to the leaders of the public sector unions and consistently made concessions that favored real estate developers and other special interests. Jack and I may differ in our politics, but we both agree that to attain a reasonable future for our children, we need to balance the damn budget. What we choose to spend money on may differ, but the bottom line is the same: a balanced budget to put the city on a secure financial footing before another pandemic or recession. How the city spends its money should reflect our values, a point that Black Lives Matter and many other progressive groups have made loud and clear over the past year with their requests for enhanced social services. However, many of those services are the responsibility of the county, not the city. The city budget is primarily responsible for public safety, police, fire, and emergency response, and for infrastructure, power, water, roads and sidewalks, parks, and public restrooms. Much as our elected officials may want to spend money on economic justice issues, that is not in their purview. Their first priority is to city residents and to ensure public safety and to maintain the infrastructure of the city. Only when those basic needs are met will there be space for improvements. Only in a safe and structurally sound city can focus shift to important societal changes. The city's budget is an important document in that it lays out how Los Angeles will provide those services. And the reality is that to maintain quality of life for all Angelenos, the city must budget for many years into the future, not just the coming fiscal year. This year, the city needs to restore services to pre-pandemic levels by rebuilding and restaffing many of its departments that were eviscerated by across-the-board cuts. Right now, the city needs to rebuild our failing infrastructure and perform necessary maintenance on the rest. Those capital costs can't be covered in a single year's budget, but the price of neglect is significantly higher than the current cost to replace. But first, we need to know the extent of the damage. The city planning department has yet to establish the infrastructure monitoring unit mandated in 1996, nor since 1999 has it prepared a report on LA's infrastructure and public services, so we have no idea of the extent of the city's fiscal exposure, except that it's in the billions. Right now, the city needs to improve public safety, and this includes cracking down on overzealous policing and engaging more positively with all Angelenos. We need to address the existential danger of climate change to keep Los Angeles livable. We need to address those of our neighbors living on our streets like in some third world city. This year's budget allocated almost $1 billion to combat homelessness. But we need to invest in real solutions, not prop up the status quo of short-term developer incentive programs. Furthermore, developers are also profiting off of escalating housing prices, which is driving affordability of housing for most of our city completely. This will only get worse now that Newsom has signed SB 9 and SB 10. More than a handful of city officials are already in deep doo-doo for profiting off of developer kickbacks. We need personal accountability for every elected official and employee whose actions generate litigation and/or monetary settlements. And by not fixing infrastructure that cause accidents, our streets and sidewalks are obstacle courses for cars, pedestrians, and bicyclists. Lack of care causes trees to fall. Just one $3 million claim averted will pay for numerous proactive repairs. We need enforceable ethics regulations and a commission which will kick ass and deter malfeasance, which may lead to more claims. We need them to eradicate the power of lobbyists and enforce better campaign finance laws. At City Hall, too often budgeting becomes a competition to get their piece of the pie without an overview of the multiple interactions required to make the city work. Most of our elected officials and the department personnel act in good faith, but in ensuring they get to keep their piece of the money, it has become too easy to lurch from year to year, putting band-aids on what went before instead of excising the cancer. We need financial accountability and transparency. We need to increase efficiency, downsize bureaucracy, remove redundancies, and provide sustainable services to meet the needs of all Angelenos. We need to resolve pension costs and their impact on the budget. We need a priority ranking of core city services so there's a clear plan for the future and concrete criteria to track success. We need to ensure the reserve fund will see the city through the next emergency. We need a budgeting system that prioritizes long-term planning and avoids the bad decisions of the blinkered 1 year at a time approach. We need a qualified city manager who's empowered to work, who's empowered to work effectively and not hamstrung by petty politics and rivalries arising from the current siloization of city departments. We need to call on the boys and girls at City Hall to play nicely in the sandbox, to stop robbing our children. And now Jack will talk about what the future holds for them.
Hey, Freddie, how do I share something?
You click on the green button with the arrow that says share screen, and then a pop-up window should open up, and then you can choose whatever document or like a Word doc. There you go.
Okay, is that on?
Yep, I can see the Excel sheet.
Okay, I'm Jack Humphreyville, and I'm affiliated with the Greater Wilshire Neighborhood Council. I'm its budget representative, and I'm also a budget advocate. And along with Liz, we had the misfortune or fortune to be the co-chairs last year. Enough to drive you crazy. But we'll take questions at the end. So if you let me go through about a 6 or 7 minute spiel, I'd appreciate it. Basically, as Liz mentioned, the goal is to put the city on a solid financial footing so that it's able to weather another recession or pandemic. And the first step is to have a truly balanced budget where we eliminate the structural deficit and have a robust reserve fund. The city also needs to address its billions in undisclosed long-term liabilities, including unfunded pension liabilities and its deferred maintenance budget. The homeless situation will also require some additional money. We're also concerned about what we call intergenerational theft, where we dump billions of today's costs on the next generations of Angelenos. That would include pensions and deferred, crappy straits. This year's budget, as for this year's budget, it's balanced thanks to, as Liz mentioned, a $1.3 billion contribution, cash infusion from the feds. The city has a healthy reserve fund of about $500 million, again, thanks to Washington. So life is good, but nothing to worry about this year. Next year is another story. The city is anticipating a budget gap next year of $260 million. This may be understated because there may be a number of programs that will be continued that were financed with one-time money, again, thanks to the feds. This is what we call the beginning of the structural deficit, where the growth in revenues does not cover the increase in expenditures. This results in budget gaps for the next several years, especially when future pay raises are considered. This shortfall may increase if the city decides to increase the funding for various programs, such as services to the homeless. To finance this shortfall, the city will have to cut services or raid the reserve fund, or a combination of both. It also has the option to raise taxes, but this requires the approval of voters, which could take a considerable amount of time. Another issue that will add to the structural deficit are those costs with new labor agreements with the city's civilian and sworn employees. The civilian contracts begin to expire in December of 22, while those for the police and firefighters expire in June of 2024. To give you an example of the impact of labor agreements with the public sector unions, in October of 2019, the city entered into agreements with the cops and the firefighters. These agreements blew a $150 million hole in the existing budget and resulted in annual shortfalls of $200 to $400 million in each of the next 4 years. The total hit was about $1.5 billion over a 5-year period. To give you a better understanding of how the impact of these new labor agreements will, look at the spreadsheet that I posted on the post that I shared on the website or on the screen. The city is on the top line, second line, you'll see that the city is anticipating a budget surplus of $157 million on record revenues of over $8 billion. That does not include the impact of new labor agreements. If the cost of new labor agreements of $220 million are financed into projections, their surplus quickly turns into a $63 million deficit. You can see that in the first red figure. And this estimate of the cost of the new labor agreement may be, I believe, are understated, especially given what happened in 2019. There are also a number of unestimated costs. The city needs to have a robust reserve fund. This will require contributions of about $50 million a year for the next several years to achieve a funding level equal to 10% of general fund revenues. The city is also scrimping on the repair and maintenance of our streets and the rest of our infrastructure. Proper funding would require a minimum of $250 million a year, according to a previous comment, according to one of our former city administrative officers. The city is also underestimating the cost of its pension plans by relying on an overly optimistic rate assumption of 7%. If the rate were 6%, a rate recommended by some hayseed from Omaha, Nebraska, a guy named Warren Buffett, then the city would need to contribute an extra $500 billion a year. And more than likely, the city will need to increase funding for homeless services, for the homeless. If you add all these numbers together, you'll go down to the bottom line, you'll see that the structural deficit, the structural deficit is $963 million. And just for giggles, we'll call it $1 billion. That's real money. Now, people may say that's an academic argument. It is not, and it's certainly not going to be an academic argument to the next generation of the Angelenos. There are a number of long-term liabilities that the city has. There's about $2 billion of outstanding debt, whether the general obligation bonds or lease arrangements, but that's manageable. I mean, the city, that's pretty much under control, and relative to a number of other cities, that's a reasonable amount of money. Where we're getting picked off is two ways. One are the pensions. As of June 30th, 2020, the unfunded liability was about $12 billion. Now, this liability is going to be significantly reduced because there were some pretty fat returns for the year ending June 30th, 2021. And that will knock that net number down considerably, probably, I would say, anywhere from $5 to $8 billion. Nevertheless, there will be a huge unfunded liability that we're going to have to address. We'll find out more in November when they issue the interim report. The other real liability is going to be is our infrastructure, and I think that's going to total more than $10 billion. This includes repairs to the streets and sidewalks of $6 billion, $2 billion for rec and parks, $2 billion for the expansion of the Civic Center and Convention Center, $1 billion for flood control, and another $1 billion for the restoration of the Los Angeles River. And this doesn't include billions to comply with the Clean Water Act. By the way, I'm not winging them on this. If you go to the city's information statement that's on the CEO's website, that number is on page A41, just in case you don't have anything else to do with your spare time. So the question is, what can we do? Well, I think the first thing is, and we've been harping on this for a number of years, is for the city to implement the recommendations of the LA 2020 Commission that was formed at the suggestion of former City Council President Herb Wesson. There are three things there. One, establish an Office of Transparency and Accountability to oversee the budget and finances of the city in real time, not a couple of weeks later, but when they're doing it, so we have a good understanding of what's going on. The second would be to form a pension commission to review and analyze the city's 2 underfunded pension programs and make recommendations on how to reduce, if not eliminate, those unfunded liabilities. And the third would be to implement multi-year budgeting, which a number of other cities and states, do. It's a fairly common practice. I think another thing is to develop an infrastructure plan. What is the city going to spend on streets and sidewalks and buildings and facilities? What's that plan over the next 5 to 10 years? I believe the CAO's office is actually working on something that right now. I'll also come back to something Liz mentioned, which is to appoint a city manager. City manager would basically be responsible for the operations of the city, whether it's whether it's public works, transportation, building and safety, planning, but it's basically somebody who can oversee the operations and has managerial experience. There's not a whole lot of that at City Hall. I mean, I don't think Eric Garcetti's ever managed anything in his life other than a campaign. I think we also we've sort of gone and said it would be nice to have a ballot measure that would prohibit the city from entering into any labor contract that would produce a deficit. Now, if we got that on the ballot, it would be World War III. But it's a pretty common sense amendment. You don't go out there entering into contracts that are going to break the bank, that are going to bust the budget. And finally, we can use our vote. And how do we do that? To oust people in the city council is going to be tough. But I think what we do is we make the budget an issue in the upcoming elections for the mayor, for the city attorney, for the controller, and for I think 8 council members that are going to be on the ballot. And I think you go out there and you just pester the hell out of them and expect answers. Sort of in conclusion, the city has some significant budget and financial issues that must be addressed. These include the structural deficit, unfunded pension liabilities, and our infrastructure. All of which, if not addressed, contribute to intergenerational theft, where we dump billions on the next generations of Angelenos. That is unacceptable. So Liz and I will, stand ready for your darts and your questions. So have at it. Thank you.
Jack, there was one question in the chat. I just sent it to you separately.
By email?
Yeah, but it's I'll read it from the chat.
Okay.
You sort of answered it. These projections on revenue numbers, how are they calculated, and how have they been accurate in the past? You may want to also give people the tools to do some research on their own.
Yeah, I would say that the 4-year budget outlook is prepared by the city administrative officer, and they do a very good job. I mean, I think they have people that know what they're doing. I think they take a lot of pride in their job, and for the most part, the numbers are fairly decent. The revenue numbers are, they go sort of line by line, if you will, and sort of estimate those, and they just sort of estimate that. And I found that they've probably been a little, in certain areas, they've been a little conservative relative to what's happened in the past. They don't get paid for overestimating, let's put it that way. And if they overestimate, that's going to cause problems. Actually, we'll have one problem this year in that the revenues from real estate taxes will not be as much, because the city was projecting a 6% increase in the grand list or the assessed value, and it looks like it's only going to be 4% this year, but it's still pretty hefty. So I would say, so I think the revenue numbers are decent, and I think the expenditure numbers are pretty decent. The one bitch that I would have is that in the 4-year budget outlook, the city administrative officer does not make any assumptions as to the cost of new labor agreements, and I find that a major league flaw. Now they get in. I think the argument is, well, we don't want to give away, what our bargaining strategy is, with regards to our labor agreements. So I think in that regard, I don't buy that. I think that it needs to really reflect, some of the, you can make some kind of assumption. Make 2%, and maybe it comes in at 3% or 4%. But I think that's the major flaw. But to answer your question, I think the projections are relatively accurate, have been accurate in the past.
One thing that comes up, Jack, from time to time is how the structure of City Hall itself impacts the budget. So if we don't have other questions from other people, perhaps you want to address that after you talk about the CAO's website.
Yeah, the CAO's website is, there's a huge amount of information there. Basically, if you look at what Freddie, if you could go back. Yeah, you'll see those 6 or 7 under 21, 22 budget. I recommend you go to the PDFs as opposed to the, flip charts. That's about 2,000 pages of really good information that you can read in your spare time. But the proposed budget gives you, an overview of the budget as well as the individual departments. The bottom one is supporting it. The bottom two are supporting information in the CAO's overview, and that has some projections, and it has a number of bunch of information on what's changed from this year to from last year to this year. It also has, I mentioned, the 4-year budget outlook. So that's pretty good information. But again, it's a potload of, there's a potload of pages there. And, unless you really have some, proposed time, that's 510 pages of the proposed budget. It's 500 pages. And then there's two blue books. This one right here, the overview of the 21-22 proposed budget, is a very good synopsis. And it gives you, it gives you sort of a thumbnail sketch of what's going on. Are there some other questions here, Liz?
If people want to ask questions, they can raise their hand, I think.
Yeah, great. That's better.
And also, if you have, I had asked you about whether the City Hall government itself impacted the budget.
Say what?
How the City Hall budget, City Hall government itself impacted the budget.
What do you mean? What the City Council's budget is itself?
No, how the City Hall structure, the way it operates, impacts the budget.
Well, basically, the mayor prepares the budget, which he submits on April 20th to the City Council. And the City Council then, goes to the Budget Finance Committee, and then they go back and forth, and it has to be approved by June 1st. Now, quite frankly, now the city is in the midst of preparing the budget for the next year, for this upcoming April presentation, and the mayor just issued his policy and goals statement, which I thought was rather rosy. It didn't mention that they're talking about a $260 million shortfall, but everything's very rosy. But there's going to be a lot of work to be done. And so what happens is the mayor issues his policy and goals, and then each of the departments prepares their budget memo, which they submit to the CAO and the mayor's office, let's say a little bit before Thanksgiving. And then that information is massaged. And around February, the city starts to really develop the budget, and then it's presented on April 20th. And then, we have those hearings with the City Council, which are pretty much pro forma. Yes, the mayor prepares the budget, but I think, there's probably some input or some consideration of what the members of the City Council are looking for, because in the past, there have been very few changes from the proposed budget to the adopted budget. It's nickels and dimes. And, there might be some changes in various departments. Like one of the things we saw this year, which was a major change, is where the City Council reallocated $150 million from the police department, or that was the year before, reallocated $150 million from the police department to, I forget exactly what it was called, community needs. And that was sort of spread around the 15 council districts, not in 15 equal pieces, but more focused in on the, underserved areas of the city, which are, council district, I think there was council districts 8, 9, and 10, and 6 and 7, I want to say. So
We
that,
have,
but you basically don't have that many changes.
we have a question. Considering the trend, I just emailed it to you, Jack. Do you see it?
Is this the one in chat?
Yeah, considering trend of voting participation
Yes.
in NC elections.
Well, I mean, my biggest problem with the neighborhood councils is I don't think people are. I mean, it's not. It's first of all, it's not a hell of a lot of money. If you're talking $40,000 for 100 neighborhood council, that's $4 million. And I think a lot of that money is sort of spent on, just sort of overhead. I'm in the Greater Wilshire Neighborhood Council, and we have to pay for meeting expenses at the Ebell Theater. We have somebody transcribing the notes. I guess we give some money, out in and around town, but that's not a whole heck of a lot. I mean, my major issue with Dunn is I think they're more of a pain in the ass than they're more of a problem than the solution, because they're trying to exert a lot of authority. And quite frankly, I believe that the general manager has been given the instructions that she needs to make sure these neighborhood council people behave themselves. And I think, we as budget advocates had a horrible experience with Dunn when the general manager tried to hijack $32,000 of our money that was given to us by the neighborhood councils. So, I mean, I think the neighborhood, could they be more efficient? Yeah. But I think on the other hand, I like having neighborhood councils. It's a good gathering area. It gives us an ability to sort of get together and address problems. It may not be, all the neighborhood councils, some of them are good and some of them aren't so hot.
The one thing that some money does do is that it allows people without a lot of resources to attend and participate that might otherwise be left out of the system. And I would like to see moving forward that money be spent on childcare, continuing the Zoom meetings, at least on a hybrid level, so that people don't have to
así la gente no tiene que
drive cars and
derivar las.
okay, Spanish translator, please turn your voice off. Thank you. And also considering that it's the
Considerado que es.
okay, Spanish, can you please stop talking, Spanish interpreter? Considering climate change and pollution, we should not have people driving all over the city in rush hour to get to meetings. Obviously, if they want to meet in person, that's a great thing, but we should also allow people to not contribute. I'd like to go back to the policy and goals letter, Jack, because the mayor wants to basically hold every department to the same level as they did last year. And I think that this is unfortunate because some departments definitely need more money. We need the resources for the fire department. We need the resources for a number of other departments that provide our services. We need to look at a more equitable a splitting out of the resources among the departments. Can you speak to that?
Well, I think a lot of that's going to be where the devil's going to be in the details. For example, this year the city allocated an extra $25 million to the budget of rec and parks, and then out of the city general purpose fund, they had another $75 million to be addressed for the recreation, for the maintenance of the parks. And that's whether that's going to be continued or not, I don't know. But I think I think the mayor's budget memo is unrealistic because it doesn't go out there and address the $260 million shortfall that they're having, and nor does it address some of the long-term issues, whether it's the infrastructure or whether it's pensions. So I think there's I think there's also a lot of things in the there's not a lot of concrete things in the budget. There's all this business about equitable and sustainability and living within the financial means, various things along those lines. But I think that's all I think that's a lot of hot air.
Here's one for you, Jack. To what extent do you think it makes sense to pay down the principal on our Los Angeles debt if the inflationary outlook for the United States is going to be the highest we've experienced since the 80s? Does it make more sense to make investments now and pay the debt back later with money that is worth less than it is now?
Well, first of all, I think we should be paying down our debt, and our debt is not only general obligation of bonds and lease bonds and, some revenue bonds with regards to, the sewer system. But, we also have a pension problem that's, basically probably a $10-15 billion liability. And if we're going to use if there's any debt that we should pay down, I think it's that. Now, whether we should go out there and issue bonds, hopefully that are going to be devalued because inflation is going to be higher than the interest rate. I think the spread, if you will, between inflation and the interest rate is probably not that much to get all excited about. If we have runaway inflation, we have a lot of big issues.
What recommendations do the budget advocates have on how funds can be reallocated from the LAPD to community programs?
I don't think we really addressed that. We did not spend a lot of time on that because I think it was a very controversial issue. On the one hand, we looked at the Black Lives Matter people's budget. We also discussed, the $150 million allocation. On the other hand, we had other people coming in there, from, South LA and East LA saying, they want more cops. So, you get into some value judgments or how you're going to allocate it. And I think that's something we did not address. I think our issue, our issue is we want the city budget balance, truly balanced. We want to make sure we have a healthy reserve fund. We want to attack the long-term liabilities. The recommendations on the police department, I think, would be handled by the people that interview the police department, and they can make their own recommendations. But again, we had people on both sides of that equation.
At the morning session, the presenter was proposing cutting off money from police to allocate to the community of Watts. And I think that goes back to the same issue as Jack mentioned, as I mentioned earlier, is that the money that the city has and its purview is to address infrastructure and safety, and that the county of Los Angeles handles services.
Yeah.
So
one of the things that was interesting about the allocation of the $150 million, when the city council went out there and did it, they divided it up. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that 75% of the money went to a third of the districts. Eric did not agree with that, and I think they had to reallocate some of the money for more systematic overall things. On the other hand, a number of people sort of said, the best thing you can do is fix your streets. That's a real quality of life deal.